Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight, and greetings from California. We're coming to you live this evening from the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda outside Los Angeles. We'll see if you remember hearing this story at any point before. A caravan of impoverished migrants is now making its way up from Central America through Mexico. Their plan is to present themselves at our southern border and demand entry into our country with all the benefits, of course, that entails. The White House has vowed to stop this caravan using the armed forces if necessary, but it keeps coming. Have you heard something like that before? Well, in fact, you have. Something very similar happened just a few months ago. We watched another migrant caravan snake its way up from Central America. It finally arrived, and then the news coverage essentially stopped. But what happened next? Well, here's what happened next. Hundreds of those people in that caravan are still here in the U.S., and if recent history is any guide at all, very few of them will ever leave. Once you reach this country and claim asylum, you're usually home free. Our media don't often cover that, but the rest of the world is watching and knows it very well, and that's why they keep coming. The most recent estimates suggest that a caravan's worth of uninvited migrants arrives at our border every few days. Why is this happening? Because an entire political party is inviting it and encouraging it. They believe unchecked immigration will strengthen their hold on power. They're perfectly aware that you don't like this, but they don't care. Just yesterday, Nancy Pelosi said it would be, quote, immoral to build a wall that might stop poor people from flooding into this country. Watch.
We have to do something other than building a wall, which you characterize very well. In my view, it's immoral, expensive, ineffective, and not something that people do between countries.
Did you catch that? Securing the border is just, quote, not something people do. Not something decent people do anyway. Bigots do it. So do moral reprobates and anyone else who derives pleasure from cruelty. As MSNBC explained just today, borders are a lot like slavery or the Trail of Tears. Watch.
This is a moral outrage that harkens to the worst excesses in the history of the country, to the separation of families at the slave auction blocks,
yes,
to the separation of Native American families. It is a moral
and as Laura
outrage.
Bush said, I love you. I really do. I'd like to move next door to you and have coffee.
They're morally outraged. Well, they're always morally outraged, and the point of their moral outrage is pretty clear. America has no right to decide who lives within its borders. Americans lack the moral standing to make that decision. We are too sinful. Illegal immigrants come here because we deserve it. We meddled in their wars in the 1980s. We had the gall to get addicted to the drugs they send us. We once had segregation in the American South. Whatever, the point is this is a fallen country. 22 million illegals within our borders is just the beginning of our penance. Latin America is listening to all of this, and they are getting the message, and that's why they're on their way. Last fiscal year, 94,000 families from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador were detained at the U.S. border. Not one of these people had a right to come in, but they were not deported. Almost 100% of them are still here, and most will never leave. We are powerless in the face of this. Congress could fix it, but Congress refuses to fix it. The system is broken by design. Voters know this, of course. It's one of the main reasons they voted for Donald Trump 2 years ago. They don't hate immigrants, obviously, but they do believe America has a right to decide which immigrants to admit. All countries have that right, don't they? That would be an interesting debate. The Democratic Party and their lackeys in the media don't want to have that debate because they know they would lose. So instead, they try to bully the population into silence.
The GOP argument on immigration isn't one that's optimism-based. It's fear-based.
This is a scare tactic, right? This is the president. This immigration is a scare tactic he's using to rev up his supporters.
When you talk about caravan, you're talking about white anxiety. You're talking about old white man angst. And so when they bring up the caravan, that's all we need to do is to bring up the pictures of children being separated from their families.
In other words, shut up, racist. Well, you probably heard that before, too, like every day for the last 2 years. You hear it a lot because it's an effective political tactic, but it only works if you fall for it. You should not fall for it. Most Americans are not racists, not even close. They're decent people. They love their country, they want their country to continue, and they know that will not continue without real borders. Max Burns is spokesman for Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, a group that campaigns on behalf of migration, and he joins us tonight. Thanks a lot, Max, for joining us tonight. So, sort of a macro question first. You acknowledge this is a democracy, and democracies over time probably ought to reflect the will of the people who live within them. The majority of the population overwhelmingly thinks Americans have the right to determine who comes in from other countries. We don't have that right. It's demonstrable. Isn't this anti-democratic, the system that we have now?
I don't know that anyone's arguing that we have to take people in. This is, Tucker, a simple question of enforcing the laws that we already have. I mean, if people like Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush could make the distinction between an immigrant and a refugee, I think it's well within the capability of Congress and the president to make that same distinction today.
But we're not making that distinction. And that's the reason that of the last caravan, as you just heard, which was several months ago, almost every single member who made it within our borders is still here. We're not enforcing our own laws, and that's why we have upwards of 22 million illegal aliens within our borders. The outline's really simple. We don't have control of who's coming in or out. And it's hard to contest that when the numbers are universally acknowledged. So why is that democratic if most people don't want it?
I think it's strange that the people talking about law and order don't want to enforce, say, the Refugee Act of 1980, which was unanimously passed by the Senate. Unanimity, not something we're used to today. And who don't want to follow the process that's enshrined in our own domestic law to grant at least the application and the right to plead a case for asylum at the border. That's in the law. The problem is that process is not being followed.
Well, it's not, as you know, and I think your argument is disingenuous because you know, because you work on this issue, that the overwhelming majority of people are released within our country and never go before a judge and just stay here. And again, that's why we have 22 million. So when illegals in this country right now, it's part of the reason. So if you see a migrant caravan coming of people who have no documentation and no right to be here, it's a little concerning when the left says, well, wait a second, we deserve them because we meddled in their countries in the 80s, or we take the drugs they send us. The point that you're making and others on the left are making is this is our punishment.
No,
which is what you
Tucker,
clearly think.
You're a supply and demand conservative. You know that there can't be demand without supply. There can't be supply without demand. It's not like this is a one-way street. These are drugs that we are obsessed with as a nation due to a failed war on drugs. And there is something to be said for the fact that we have created this gang violence, this political instability in Honduras and Guatemala.
We've created it.
Through this addiction we have to drugs, and yet we are so hesitant to acknowledge the human cost that's marching toward us.
No, I guess I'm not hesitant to acknowledge the human cost. I'm struck by your hesitance to acknowledge the over 50,000 Americans who died last year of drug ODs. Where do they figure into this moral equation of yours, where we deserve to be invaded because we take their drugs? What about the families of the 50,000 who died? How much time do you spend thinking about them?
All the time. I think they would be much better served using that money we want to spend on a wall for opioid prevention, opioid education, and to rethink this entire country's addiction to heroin, crystal meth, to marijuana. Come on, Tucker, that's more useful than a wall.
Wait. A wall might stem some of the flood of illegal drugs, not all, but some that would save American lives. But that's not a concern to you because why?
Because these people
You're
are
against
seeking,
the wall because you believe it would work.
Because the people in this caravan are seeking asylum status. They're not drug runners. All the pictures that are up right now on the TV are of them checking in at police stations.
You don't know who they are, actually. You have no idea who they are, and neither do I.
Which is why we have a process for hearing their asylum claim. That's why we have a vetting process. But the macro point is, why do not, hold on. You know as well as I that a wall would give us some control, physical control over our borders. It works, which is why you hate it. Why would you argue against the right of a sovereign nation to determine who comes in? Why? What is your motive in that, honestly? I think the drugs, you would agree, are going in under the wall and over the wall and on sea routes, not so much through a point of entry like McAllen, Texas.
I'm not sure we know that, but people are certainly going on foot, and a wall would stop some of them. Why would you oppose that?
There was a report on Fox just the other day of a gigantic air-conditioned drug tunnel with a little mini subway in it. So you can't say that it's not like they haven't figured out how to get around a wall.
Yeah, so you just want to save money. You're just worried about federal expenditures. All right, we're out of time. Max, thank you.
Thank you.
Victor Davis Hanson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, also in California, and he joins us tonight. Professor, thank you very much for coming on. I'm fixated on the moral argument here beneath the policy argument, which is that the United States has no moral standing. The left is saying this. Pelosi said it. The guest I just talked to has said it. We have no moral standing. We have no right to determine who comes into our country because our history is just so bad, so awful, so sinful. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I don't even take it on its own merits, because I don't think they really believe in any consistency. Remember, it was just 30 years ago that the likes of Cesar, it was Cesar Chavez and Bill Clinton and Chuck Schumer.
Who were making the case? Right.
Yes, they were all making the case that the borders should be closed because it adversely impacted minority communities, and that it undermined union wages and entry-level workers. And then when we got 20 million, all of a sudden they said, "Wow, we flipped California, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada. This is a good thing. Let's ignore federal immigration law." And the same thing with sanctuary cities. They're good now because it fulfills a useful agenda. But believe me, if Alabama and Montana and Utah said, "You know what, in our jurisdictions, in our state, we don't want to adhere to federal orders about gay marriage or the Endangered Species Act or federal handgun registration," then all of a sudden that would be nullification and neo-Confederate in the eyes of the left. It's the Kavanaugh hearings all over again. Remember, in the nanosecond, we were going to throw out 238 years of American jurisprudence because it didn't coincide with an agenda for the Supreme Court. And then afterwards, suddenly the good blue wall electoral college that helped Obama get elected had to be jettisoned because it crumbled and gave Trump the election. And senators were wonderful from small states, the same as big states, because Obama had a supermajority in the Senate, and then that was bad. And the 9 justices were good since 1869, and suddenly they didn't flip like they usually do when a Republican. And so it's whatever is useful. The law is fluid and adaptable. It's about power, Tucker. It's not about the respect for the law and the abstract.
You're exactly right. And I think a lot of us, including me very often, are far too literal and take these arguments as if they're sincere, which they are not. Professor, thank you.
Thank you.